thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate you taking the time.
With less than 6 weeks to go before the midterm elections, Senator Ron Johnson is in the home stretch of his fight for a third term as the senior senator of Wisconsin.
I know this is kind of a late decision for you. You had cemented the idea of running for 2 terms and retiring, and then you decided to jump in to run for a third.
I think it's really because of how divisive this country has become. As I travel around Wisconsin, I'll tell you, people who support me are just tired of the division. They're tired of the anger. I find it exhausting. In a time where it just seems like this nation's coming apart, I really felt I'm there. I've had success trying to find areas of agreement, and I think I can be helpful.
On the campaign trail, Senator Johnson is building on his movements over the past 12 years in office and defending his track record.
And as a result of my efforts, again, 95% of American businesses, the mom and pop shops, Main Street businesses, got a tax cut so they could stay competitive with the big guys. And so many of them come up to me and say, we survived the pandemic. Now, the way that's being twisted in our vicious political world is I did a tax cut for myself and a couple of supporters. I mean, nothing could be further from the truth.
The campaign, all the ads, the $160 million of ads that are spent on this campaign. It's grotesque
how much is spent.
And the ads, the mudslinging against you, what would you say would be the most grotesque that's out there that are the most false claims?
Scaring seniors. I don't want to cut Social Security and Medicare. I've never said that. Never would. What elected official ever would say that? And yet Democrats every cycle say that some Republican candidate wants to cut or take away Social Security. It's a complete lie.
The Republican Party has changed, no doubt, over the last few years. It seems like before it was more policy-driven. It seems like it's more and more personality-driven. Do you think you've reinvented your personality, your persona to reflect that?
Well, first of all, I'm the exact same guy, other than I have more experience than as I was when I first ran. I think what's changed is the realignment of the party. I think the Democratic Party now has become the party of the elite. They're the ones representing the big tech media, the big tech media social media giants. They're the ones representing billionaires. We're the ones, like I just said, in my tax cuts. I fought for the small mom and pop shops, the mainstream businesses. We're the ones fighting for the working men and women of this country.
Crushing inflation is just one of several critical issues for both sides in this election cycle. One Senator Johnson calls a tax increase on the middle class.
Do you think there's any way that both parties are going to agree on any policy to make it any better?
Well, they have to stop spending money on things that we shouldn't be spending money on. I mean, they just passed this reconciliation package, 100% partisan, $369 billion. Now, I remember when $100 billion was a lot of money. Unfortunately, you've got one party that just wants to buy votes. I mean, that's what the student loan forgiveness was, trying to buy votes before the election. And I would say it's a bipartisan problem in terms of wanting to spend money. I'm part of a small group of people that continue to raise the alarm that this massive deficit spending, completely out of control, our growing debt, that threatens all these government programs.
Coming up in the next segment, Senator Johnson on January 6th.
Moving on to the alternate slate of electors. Of course, we're going to talk about that. And I know you've said publicly that it's a non-issue what happened with the slate of electors and your involvement.
I had no involvement. I received either 3 texts and I sent 2 texts, or the other way around. I mean, my lack of involvement was seconds worth of texting.
But that is still involvement.
More from our one-on-one interview as Senator Ron Johnson goes on the record.
You had once said that you once described January 6th and what happened at the Capitol that day as a peaceful protest. And what happened on the Senate side of the Capitol was more peaceful than anything else. We've seen video of a senator running down the hallway. We've seen videos of people breaking windows. We've seen some violent video even on the Senate side of the Capitol. Do you still stand by your statement?
Well, first of all, I don't think you're quoting me accurately. You'd have to take the entire context. What I did say, I wasn't personally scared on January 6th because we were immediately locked in the Senate. My assumption was that a couple of crazy people got by security. We were in the Senate for no more than 5 or 10 minutes, and we were ushered out a back step. I went back to my office. Then I turned on the TV, then I saw the violence. I condemned it immediately. I condemned it forcefully. I've condemned it repeatedly, as I condemned the violence that occurred during the 570 riots during the summer of 2020. Okay, I condemn all violence. A couple snippets of what I've said have been taken completely out of context. Again, it was true. On January 6th, I was never concerned about my own life, okay, because I didn't know what was happening. I mean, I was in the Capitol, but far away from whatever violence. And it is true, there was more violence on the House side than there was on the Senate side. And the Senate side, what ended up happening is you had that, the guy with the Viking horns walk in, and there's no violence occurred. I do believe that the vast majority of people there on January 6th were protesting peacefully, just like the vast majority of people that participated in about 8,000 protests during the summer also protested peacefully. But the fact is, 570 of those protests turned into riots, and there was, I think, 2,000 law enforcement officers injured during the summer riots, $1 to $2 billion of property damage, a couple dozen people killed, a couple people killed in Kenosha, dozens of businesses burned to the ground in Kenosha. The news media's focus is all on one day, which I condemned repeatedly.
Would you call that a riot at the Capitol?
And completely ignore what happened during the summer. Yeah, I think we all call that a riot. We all condemned it. Nobody condoned that. Nobody condoned what happened on January 6th.
Moving on to the alternate slate of electors. Of course, we're going to talk about that. And I know you've said publicly that it's a non-issue what happened with the slate of electors and your involvement.
I had no involvement. I received either 3 texts and I sent 2 texts, or the other way around. I mean, my lack of involvement was seconds worth of texting.
But that is still involvement.
But I didn't even know. I was texted that something had to be delivered to the vice president. I didn't know what it was, and was there somebody that could help arrange delivery? So then I talked to my chief of staff, and he took care of it. We found out that the vice president wasn't accepting anything. He said, can't deliver anything. That was the end of story.
But if he would have said yes?
You can't call that involvement.
But if he would have said yes, go ahead and deliver it, even though you didn't know what it was?
What would you do if you get a call? If you get a call from the president of the United States lawyer wanting to get something to the vice president?
But you didn't know what it was.
Again,
wouldn't you want to inquire what something is to hand to the vice president of the United States during such a critical time?
I didn't hand anything to the president. I wasn't involved.
But if he would have said sure.
I wasn't involved. You can make it seem I wasn't involved. A couple texts, a few seconds of my time. I couldn't even remember what I had done, which is why it took a little while to piece it all together. But we pieced it all together. I received 3 texts and I sent 2, or vice versa.
Was Sean Riley working rogue? Did he go rogue? Was he working on his own?
He was my new chief of staff. He'd worked for me earlier. He'd been in the White House. He knew these people. Somebody was asking him to arrange a delivery of something to the vice president. He contacted the people that he knew for the vice president, said, we're not accepting anything. End of story.
So he knew what he was doing, even though no one knew what that thing was.
We weren't doing anything. We were we supposed to deliver something or not? Did the vice president want it? The vice president didn't. We didn't deliver anything. It's a complete non-story. I know the news media is trying to turn it into a story. I know the January 6th committee tried to turn it into a story. They didn't do their due diligence. They didn't, by the way, publish the full text exchange, which shows the vice president was expecting this. It was supposed to be delivered some other way.
If you're subpoenaed, would you testify?
That's speculative. There's nothing to subpoena me about.
But if you were, would you testify?
Listen, I would probably honor subpoena, sure.
More on the record with Senator Ron Johnson. Coming up tonight, we talk about top secret documents, same-sex marriage, Wisconsin jobs, and gun reform.
You said you would support the laws that are already in the books, such as...
Well, why don't you... No, I would support enforcing the laws that are already in the books. We don't do that right now.
Such as? Like what would help?
I don't know, background checks.
Tonight on NBC 26 News at 10. In the weeks leading up to November 8th, we're leaning in on some of the hot-button issues on the minds of voters.
You served on the Senate Committee on Homeland Security, Governmental Affairs. How concerned are you about these documents that were taken out of the White House and brought into Mar-a-Lago into
Mar-a-Lago
secure
that's secured and guarded by Secret Service individuals, not particularly concerned at all.
There's been a lot of security breaches there. There's members of the public that are in this club that are around that are have access to these documents.
I'm also fully aware of how we overclassify documents. I'm also aware of the fact that President Trump has the ultimate declassification authority. I think the search warrant was completely unwarranted. I'm highly concerned about the partisanship and the politicization of the FBI and the Department of Justice under this administration.
I want to talk about gun control. You had voted
And
again.
you really ought to talk about the issues that Wisconsinites are concerned about. Out of control inflation, 40-year high inflation. You ought to be talking about what were record gas prices.
Gun control is an issue that Wisconsinites particularly care about.
People on the left.
Oh.
We have 10,000 gun control laws in this country, 10,000. We don't enforce them. Before we pass another gun control law, what we ought to do is enforce the ones that are already on the books.
Would you be willing to support any gun control reform?
I'd be willing to support enforcing the laws we already have on the books.
Such as? Like what would help?
I don't know,
would
background
help?
checks. Did we enforce that against Hunter Biden when he probably violated the background checks?
I do want to ask you about the Oshkosh contract and how the 1,000 jobs went to South Carolina instead of staying here in Wisconsin to build those new postal trucks. Why was there not a further push to keep those here?
Well, first of all, Oshkosh Corporation doesn't have the capacity to build them here. They needed a large factory that was not available. There was one available in South Carolina. The greatest benefit to Oshkosh would be to keep that contract, let them produce those vehicles where they can produce them, so we can maintain the managerial and the engineering jobs here in Oshkosh.
The two-term incumbent has had a stronghold among Republicans in the Badger State and has the backing by former President Donald Trump. But Senator Johnson has been a magnet for criticism from Democrats and has recently faced backlash for saying he won't support same-sex marriage in its current state.
Well, let's talk about same-sex marriage. You recently said you have an issue with the way that it's written currently.
What I've said about same-sex marriage is I always felt that the solution was civil unions. I supported civil unions. It's completely different versus Roe v. Wade. That was overturned because you're protecting life prospectively. You're not going to mess up people's lives retroactively. So this attempt to codify is completely unnecessary. It's divisive. And I've just laid that out. This is a political movement. Democrats simply can't leave any wound healed.
In a tough re-election battle, voters will have to settle in on what's going to determine their choice come November.
What you ought to do is you ought to be talking to Mandela Barnes, if you can ever find him, and ask him some pretty pointed questions. He will not be honest with he's not being honest with the voters of Wisconsin. He's disavowing past positions. He's running away from them. But the media ought to be asking him questions that the Wisconsin public needs to hear.
NBC 26 is scheduled to interview Democratic U.S. Senate candidate Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes later this week. In Green Bay, Nina Sparano, NBC 26.